Elizabeth Stone pressed her back against the stone wall of the burning Wickiup, her heart hammering, as gunfire erupted around her. Through the acrid smoke, she could see Apache families fleeing in terror. Mothers clutching infants, children stumbling over bodies of their elders. The dawn raid had turned into a massacre, and she was trapped in the middle of it. In her arms, 8-year-old Ayanna gasped for breath blood, seeping through the makeshift bandage Elizabeth had torn from her own petticoat. The bullet had punctured the child's lung, and without immediate surgery, she would drown in her own blood within the hour. Beside them, baby Joseph burned with fever, his tiny chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. "Miss Elizabeth," Ayanna whispered in halting English, her dark eyes wide with pain and trust. "Am I going to die?" Elizabeth looked into those trusting eyes and felt something break inside her chest. Around them, the village of Chief Running Bear, a man who had sought peace with the white settlers, was being systematically destroyed. The old chief himself lay dead near his Wickiup, cut down while trying to surrender. "No, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, tightening her grip on both children. "I won't let that happen." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they might be a lie. The root cellar where they hid was filling with smoke, and she could hear boots approaching above. Through the cracks in the wooden cover, she glimpsed a face that made her blood run cold. Deputy Samuel Hayes, his eyes bright with something that looked disturbingly like pleasure. "Search every hole," Hayes barked to his men. "I want to be certain we got them all." Elizabeth closed her eyes and made a silent prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening. She had come to deliver medicine to the sick, as she had done dozens of times before. Instead, she had become witness to a slaughter, and possibly the only thing standing between these children and death. The sound of splintering wood made her look up. Hayes was prying open the cellar cover with his rifle barrel, his face twisted in concentration. In seconds, he would find them. Elizabeth Stone, army nurse and secret friend to the Apache people, had perhaps 30 seconds to decide whether to surrender and hope for mercy or fight a man with a gun while protecting 2 dying children. She chose to fight. 3 weeks earlier, Elizabeth had walked the dusty streets of Prescott, Arizona territory, her medical bag hidden beneath a shawl as she made her way to the edge of town. The summer of 1870 had been particularly brutal drought, had withered the crops Apache raids had intensified, and the territorial government was pushing harder than ever for a final solution to what they called the Indian problem. At 29, Elizabeth had served as an army nurse for 6 years, first during the final months of the Civil War, then here in the unforgiving desert. She had seen enough death to last several lifetimes, but it was the needless suffering that haunted her, the Apache children who died from diseases that could be easily treated, the mothers who lost babies to infections that a few cents worth of medicine could prevent. The Army regulations were clear. Medical supplies were for military personnel and authorized civilians only. But Elizabeth had long ago decided that her oath to preserve life transcended the arbitrary boundaries drawn by politicians and generals. She reached the rendezvous point, a cluster of rocks beside Adobe Creek, just as the sun touched the horizon. From the shadows emerged a figure she had come to know well. Nalnish, an Apache woman, whose husband had been killed in a skirmish the previous winter. The woman's face was drawn with worry. "Miss Stone," Nalnish said in careful English, "my nephew is very sick. The burning sickness in his chest. He cannot breathe." Elizabeth nodded, recognizing the symptoms of pneumonia. "I have medicine, but we must be careful. There are more patrols now." As they made their way along the hidden paths toward the Apache settlement, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. More than once she thought she glimpsed movement in the rocks above the glint of metal in the fading light. "Nalnish," she said quietly, "has anyone else been asking about me about these meetings?" The Apache woman's face darkened. "There is talk. Some say there is a white man who offers silver for information about the people who help us. But no one would speak of you to such a man." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. Someone was hunting her, and that someone had money to spend on information. The question was who? Sheriff Marcus Redfield stood in his office staring at the two graves behind his house as the sun set over the Arizona mountains. 10 years had passed since the Apache raid that had taken his wife Sarah and daughter Emma, but the pain remained as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. He was a man haunted by ghosts, not the supernatural kind, but the memories that crept up on him in quiet moments. Sarah's laugh echoing through their small home, Emma's tiny hand in his as they walked to Sunday service, the charred remains of their bodies after the Apache war party had finished with them. For a decade, he had pursued justice with the single-minded determination of a man who had nothing left to lose. He had tracked down the warriors responsible for the raid, seen them hanged or shot, and still the hollow ache in his chest remained unfilled. Sheriff Deputy Samuel Hayes appeared in the doorway, his lean frame silhouetted against the evening light. "Got a minute?" Redfield turned from the window, noting the excitement in his deputy's eyes. Hayes had been with the department for 2 years, a former cavalry sergeant who had come highly recommended by his commanding officer. He was efficient, ruthless when necessary, and shared Redfield's dedication to bringing order to the territory. "What is it, Sam?" Hayes stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "Got some information about that Apache problem we've been discussing. Seems there's been some unauthorized activity going on." Redfield frowned. "What kind of activity?" "The kind that involves Army medical supplies finding their way to Apache camps. The kind that might explain why some of these raids have been so well coordinated lately." Hayes placed a small object on Redfield's desk, a glass vial with a Military Medical Corps label. "Found this in the ruins of an Apache camp we hit last week. Morphine? Military issue." Redfield picked up the vial, his mind racing. Military medical supplies were carefully controlled, distributed only to authorized personnel. For them to end up in Apache hands meant either theft or treason. Any idea who might be responsible? Hayes leaned against the desk, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've been doing some investigating. There's an Army nurse who's been seen in the area quite a bit. Taking long walks, she calls them. Nature studies. A nurse, Elizabeth Stone, works at the fort, has access to medical supplies, knows the territory well enough to avoid patrols. And..." Hayes paused for effect. "She's been seen talking to Apache women in town." Redfield set the vial down carefully. The idea of a white woman, a nurse sworn to save lives, providing aid to the people who had murdered his family, should have filled him with rage. Instead, he felt only a weary sadness. "What do you want to do about it?" Hayes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I want to catch her in the act, set up a trap. When she makes her next delivery, we'll be waiting. And then we'll have evidence of treason. And maybe, just maybe, we'll finally be able to deal with this Apache problem once and for all." Redfield nodded slowly, but something in Hayes's tone made him uneasy. His deputy was talking about evidence and legal proceedings, but the look in his eyes suggested he had something far more permanent in mind. "Sam," Redfield said carefully, "if we do this, we do it by the book. No vigilante justice, no shortcuts. The woman gets a fair trial." Hayes's smile widened. "Of course, Sheriff, by the book." But after Hayes left, Redfield sat alone in his office staring at the medical vial and wondering if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The Apache settlement lay hidden in a box canyon 20 miles from Prescott, its wiki-ups scattered among the rocks like brown flowers blooming in the desert. Elizabeth had been coming here for nearly a year, bringing medicine and basic medical care to people who had no other source of healing. Chief Running Bear was an old man now, his face lined with the weight of leading his people through impossible times. Unlike the younger war chiefs who advocated for continued fighting, Running Bear sought a path of peace, a middle way that might allow his people to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. "Miss Stone." He greeted her in English as she approached his wiki-up. You honor us with your presence." Elizabeth bowed respectfully. "The honor is mine, Chief. I've brought medicine for the children." As she worked treating cases of dysentery, pneumonia, and infected wounds, Elizabeth became aware of tension in the camp. The younger warriors watched her with suspicion, their hands never far from their weapons. Even the women seemed more guarded than usual. "Chief," she said quietly as she bandaged a child's arm, "is there something wrong? Some problem I should know about?" Running Bear's weathered face grew grave. "There are rumors, Miss Stone. Talk of white men offering silver for information about our friends. Some of my people fear you may be in danger." Elizabeth's hands stilled on the bandage. "What kind of danger?" "The kind that comes when men decide that peace is less profitable than war." Before Elizabeth could ask what he meant, a commotion erupted at the canyon entrance. A young Apache warrior came running, his face flushed with exertion and fear. "Soldiers!" he gasped. Many soldiers coming fast. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Women gathered their children, men reached for weapons, elders began chanting prayers. Elizabeth looked around wildly, her mind racing. If the army found her here, she would be arrested for treason. But if she ran, she would be abandoning people who needed her help. "Miss Stone," Running Bear said urgently, "you must go. Now, take the north path, stay in the rocks." "But the children?" "We'll be safe. We are not at war with the army. This is probably just a patrol." Elizabeth gathered her medical supplies and headed for the canyon mouth, her heart pounding. But as she reached the rocks, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of rifles being cocked, the harsh voices of men preparing for violence. "Remember," a familiar voice called out. "We're here to arrest Chief Running Bear for cattle rustling." But if they resist, it was Hayes's voice, and the tone made Elizabeth's skin crawl. This wasn't a patrol or an arrest. This was something far worse. She had to warn them. But as she turned back toward the camp, she saw Hayes himself emerging from the rocks behind her, his rifle pointed directly at her heart. "Well, well," he said softly, his eyes bright with triumph. "Look what we have here. The famous Angel of Mercy caught red-handed." Elizabeth raised her hand slowly, her medical bag still clutched in her left fist. "Deputy Hayes, I was just providing aid and comfort to the enemy." Hayes finished. "Don't worry, Miss Stone. You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself to a judge. Assuming, of course, that you survive the next few minutes." From the canyon below came the sound of gunfire. Not the disciplined volleys of a military operation, but the chaotic shooting of a massacre. Elizabeth's heart lurched as she realized what was happening. "You're not here to arrest anyone," she breathed. "You're here to kill them all." Hayes smiled, and Elizabeth saw madness dancing in his eyes. Finally, someone who understands. "Yes, Miss Stone. I'm here to solve the Apache problem once and for all. And you're going to help me do it." "Never." "Oh, but you are. Because if you don't walk down into that canyon right now, I'm going to put a bullet in your spine and drag you down there myself. And then I'm going to tell everyone how the traitorous army nurse died trying to protect her Apache friends." Elizabeth looked at the rifle pointed at her chest, then at the smoke rising from the canyon, where people she had come to care about were fighting for their lives. She had perhaps 10 seconds to decide surrender and hope for mercy, or try to fight a man with a gun while protecting innocent people. She chose to fight. Elizabeth threw her medical bag directly at Hayes's face, causing him to duck instinctively. In that split second, she dove behind a boulder, pulling the small derringer she always carried from her boot. The gun held only 2 shots, but it was better than nothing. "A clever girl." Hayes called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "But you're only delaying the inevitable. My men have orders to shoot anyone who tries to escape." Elizabeth peered around the boulder, trying to spot Hayes's position. The sounds of battle from the canyon were growing worse. Screams, gunfire, the crackle of flames. She had to get down there, had to help somehow. A rifle bullet chipped rock inches from her head, sending stone fragments stinging across her cheek. Hayes was moving, trying to get a better angle on her hiding spot. "You know what I find interesting, Miss Stone?" Hayes called out conversationally. "All this time you've been playing the noble savior, bringing medicine to the poor, suffering Apache. But did you ever stop to think about what your kindness was really accomplishing?" Elizabeth didn't answer, using the sound of his voice to locate his position. He was moving closer, confident in his superior firepower. "Every Apache child you saved grew up to be a warrior." Hayes continued. "Every infection you cured, every fever you broke, every wound you healed, all of it just meant more enemies for decent white families to face. How many settlers died because you kept their killers alive?" The words hit Elizabeth like physical blows. She had asked herself the same questions in the dark hours of the night, wondered if her compassion was naive, if her efforts to preserve life were ultimately causing more death. "But that's not really why you're here, is it?" She called back, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "This isn't about protecting settlers. It's about money." Hayes's laughter echoed off the rocks. "Very good, Miss Stone. Yes, it's about money. Lots and lots of money. Do you have any idea how valuable Apache land is? How much certain interests are willing to pay to have it cleared? So you're just a hired killer." "I'm a businessman. And business, I'm afraid, is about to be concluded." Elizabeth heard the sound of boots on rock getting closer. Hayes was moving in for the final shot. She gripped the derringer tighter, knowing she would have only one chance to use it. But before she could act, a new voice cut through the desert air, Sheriff Redfield's voice sharp with command. "Hayes, stand down." Elizabeth peered around the boulder to see Redfield emerging from the canyon, his face black with smoke and fury. Behind him came several soldiers, their uniforms dirty and their expressions grim. "Sheriff," Hayes called out, not lowering his rifle. "Perfect timing. I've got the traitor cornered." "I said stand down, Deputy. She's a spy sheriff, a traitor. She's been feeding information to the Apache, helping them plan their raids." Redfield's eyes found Elizabeth behind the boulder, and she saw something in his expression that surprised her, not hatred or condemnation, but weary sadness. "Come out, Miss Stone," he said quietly. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Elizabeth looked at Hayes, whose rifle was still trained on her position, and then at Redfield, who was slowly approaching with his hands visible. She had to make a choice: trust the sheriff who had spent a decade hunting Apache, or continue to hide behind a rock while people died in the canyon below. She chose to trust. Elizabeth stood up slowly, the derringer still in her hand, but pointed at the ground. "Sheriff Redfield, I can explain." "No need." Redfield said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I've seen enough." "Sheriff," Hayes said urgently, "she's been providing aid to the enemy. She's a traitor." "Maybe," Redfield said, still looking at Elizabeth. "But right now, I'm more concerned about what I found in that canyon." Hayes's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "I mean 37 dead Apache, including 15 children. I mean women shot in the back while trying to flee. I mean Chief Running Bear, who was trying to surrender, cut down in cold blood." Elizabeth felt the world tilt around her. 37 dead. Children among them. The people she had come to help, the families she had watched grow, all gone. "They were resisting arrest," Hayes said quickly. "They opened fire on us." "With what?" Redfield's voice was cold as winter steel. "I didn't find a single weapon in the entire camp. Not one rifle, not one pistol. They were defenseless." Hayes's rifle swung toward Redfield. "You don't understand, Sheriff. This was necessary. The only way to solve the problem permanently. More. The only problem I see," Redfield said, his hand moving to his own weapon, "is a deputy who's forgotten the difference between law and murder." Elizabeth watched the confrontation unfold, her mind racing. Hayes was cornered, desperate and armed. Redfield was tired grieving and clearly struggling with his own demons. And somewhere in the canyon below, there might still be survivors who needed help. "Sheriff," she said carefully, "there are wounded people down there. People who need immediate medical attention." "I know," Redfield said without taking his eyes off Hayes. "That's why we're going to sort this out quickly." Hayes's rifle barrel shifted slightly, and Elizabeth realized with horror that he was preparing to shoot Redfield in the back. Without thinking, she raised her derringer and fired. The bullet caught Hayes in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. He staggered, clutching the wound, his face twisted with pain and fury. "You shot me," he gasped, staring at Elizabeth in disbelief. "You actually shot me." "I saved your life," Elizabeth said quietly. "If you had killed the sheriff, his men would have hung you." Redfield was already moving, kicking Hayes's rifle away and drawing his own weapon. "Samuel Hayes, you're under arrest for murder conspiracy and violations of territorial law. You don't understand." Hayes said, his voice rising to a near shriek. "I was following orders. Orders from people who matter, people with real power. You think you can just arrest me and this all goes away?" "Whose orders?" Redfield demanded. Hayes laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You'll find out soon enough, Sheriff. When the territorial governor asks why you interfered with a legitimate military operation. When the Land Commission wants to know why you protected a traitor and a spy." Elizabeth felt ice forming in her chest. Hayes wasn't just a rogue deputy, he was part of something larger, something that reached all the way to the territorial government. "It doesn't matter," she said, as much to herself as to the others. "Right now, there are people dying in that canyon. Everything else can wait." Redfield nodded slowly. "You're right. Hayes, you're going to sit right here while Miss Stone and I see what we can do for the survivors." "There are no survivors," Hayes said with vicious satisfaction. "I made sure of that." But as they made their way down into the canyon, Elizabeth heard something that gave her hope. The sound of a child crying, weak but alive, coming from the ruins of what had once been a proud Apache settlement. She began to run. Elizabeth found them in the root cellar of Chief Running Bear's Wiki-Up Ayanna, the 8-year-old granddaughter of the chief and baby Joseph, barely 2 years old. Both were wounded, both were dying, and both were looking at her with eyes that held a trust she wasn't sure she deserved. "Miss Elizabeth," Ayanna whispered, blood frothing on her lips. "They killed grandfather. They killed everyone." Elizabeth knelt beside the children, her hands automatically moving to assess their injuries. Ayanna had been shot in the chest, the bullet puncturing her lung. Joseph was burning with fever, his tiny body racked with pain from internal injuries she couldn't immediately identify. "Shh," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "I'm here now. I'm going to take care of you." She began working with the supplies from her medical bag, but it was immediately clear that she needed more than field medicine. Ayanna needed surgery, and Joseph needed treatment she couldn't provide in a burning canyon. "Sheriff," she called up to Redfield, who was standing guard over Hayes. "I need to get these children to the fort. They won't survive without proper medical care." "You know that's impossible," Redfield said, his voice heavy with regret. "If you bring Apache children to the fort, they'll be arrested as enemy combatants. They're babies. They're Apache babies. To the army, that's the same thing." Elizabeth looked at the children, then at the smoke rising from the destroyed village, then at Hayes, who was watching the exchange with cruel satisfaction. "Then we don't take them to the fort," she said quietly. "We take them somewhere else." Where? Elizabeth's mind raced through possibilities. The mission in Phoenix was too far. The children would die before they reached it. The reservation was under military guard. There was nowhere safe for Apache children in the Arizona territory. "Except your house," she said suddenly. "It's outside town, isolated. No one would think to look there." Redfield stared at her, as if she had suggested flying to the moon. "You want me to hide Apache children in my house? The house where my wife and daughter were killed by Apache raiders. I want you to help me save the lives of 2 innocent children," Elizabeth said firmly. "Children who had nothing to do with what happened to your family." Redfield was quiet for a long moment, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "My daughter Emma was 8 years old when she died. Same age as this one." Elizabeth held her breath, waiting for his decision. "All right," Redfield said finally. "But we'll need to move fast, and we'll need to be very, very careful." Hayes laughed from where he sat, bleeding against a rock. "You think this is over? You think hiding a couple of Apache brats is going to solve anything, Sheriff? You have no idea what you're getting into." "Maybe not," Redfield said quietly. "But I know what I'm getting out of the business of killing children." As they prepared to move the wounded children, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes was right about one thing: this was far from over. Whatever conspiracy had orchestrated the massacre was still out there, still powerful, still dangerous. But for now, all that mattered was getting Ayanna and Joseph to safety. Everything else would have to wait. The journey to Redfield's house took 3 hours, moving carefully through the desert darkness with 2 critically wounded children. Elizabeth rode with Ayanna cradled in her arms, feeling the girl's labored breathing growing weaker with each mile. Joseph, burning with fever, was wrapped in Redfield's coat, his tiny face flushed and his eyes closed. Hayes, his shoulder roughly bandaged, rode with his hands tied to the saddle horn. He had been mostly silent during the journey, but Elizabeth could feel his eyes on her, calculating planning. "You know," he said quietly as they approached Redfield's small adobe house, "this is all going to come out eventually. The territorial governor, the land commission, the army, they all have too much invested in solving the Apache problem to let this slide." "Let them come," Redfield said without looking back. "I've got nothing left to lose. You have your life, your reputation, your badge. All things that won't matter much if I stand by and watch children die." Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude for the sheriff, this man who had spent a decade consumed by hatred and loss, only to rediscover his humanity at the crucial moment. Redfield's house was small but well built, with thick adobe walls and a sturdy roof. Inside it was spartanly furnished, a man's house. Elizabeth realized a place where someone lived but didn't truly inhabit. "There's a bedroom in the back," Redfield said, leading them through the main room. It was my daughter's room. It's been empty for 10 years. Elizabeth followed him into the small bedroom. Noting the child-sized bed, the wooden toys still arranged on a shelf, and the drawings still pinned to the walls. This was a shrine to a lost daughter, a place where grief had been preserved like a flower pressed between pages. "Sheriff," Elizabeth said gently, "are you sure about this?" Redfield looked at the bed, then at Ayanna in Elizabeth's arms, then at the drawings on the wall. "Emma would have wanted me to help them," he said quietly. "She never could stand to see anything hurt." Elizabeth laid Ayanna gently on the small bed, then placed Joseph beside her. The children looked impossibly small in the room, their dark skin a stark contrast to the white sheets. "I'll need supplies," Elizabeth said, her medical training taking over. "Bandages, clean water, laudanum if you have it. And I'll need to operate on the girl. The bullet has to come out." "I'll get what I can from town," Redfield said. "But it'll have to be discreet. If anyone finds out what we're doing—" "They won't," Elizabeth said firmly. "Not if we're careful." As Redfield prepared to leave, Hayes called out from the main room where he had been tied to a chair. "Sheriff, you're making a mistake. These children are going to die anyway. You're just prolonging their suffering." "Maybe," Redfield said, pausing in the doorway. "But at least I'll know I tried to do something decent." "Decent?" Hayes laughed harshly. "There's nothing decent about what you're doing. You're harboring enemy combatants, protecting a traitor, interfering with territorial policy. When this all comes out, and it will come out, you'll be lucky if they don't hang you. Elizabeth saw Redfield's shoulders tense, saw the doubt creeping into his posture. Hayes was good at this, finding weakness, exploiting fear, turning people against each other. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "these children aren't your enemies. They're not anyone's enemies. They're just hurt and scared and far from home." Redfield turned to look at her, his face shadowed in the lamplight. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you see past all the hatred, all the history, all the blood?" Elizabeth looked at Ayanna, whose breathing was becoming more labored, and then at Joseph, whose fever seemed to be spiking again. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just know that when I see a child in pain, nothing else matters." Redfield nodded slowly. "I'll be back with supplies. Keep them alive until then." As the sheriff left, Elizabeth turned her attention to the children. Ayanna was conscious, but barely so, her eyes fluttering open and closed. Joseph was burning with fever, his tiny body fighting something Elizabeth couldn't identify. From the main room, Hayes continued his psychological assault. "You know this can't last, Miss Stone. Even if you save them, what then? They're Apache children in a white man's territory. They'll never be safe here." Elizabeth ignored him, focusing on her patients. She had faced hopeless situations before, had pulled people back from the brink of death when everyone else had given up. She wasn't going to stop now, but as she worked through the night, fighting to keep 2 children alive, while a madman whispered poison from the next room, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever forces had orchestrated the massacre were still out there, still planning, still dangerous. And sooner or later, they would come for her. Elizabeth performed the surgery on Ayanna by lamplight, using instruments sterilized in boiling water and techniques learned in field hospitals during the war. The girl's lung had been punctured by the bullet, but the wound was clean, and Elizabeth was able to repair the damage without causing further trauma. Joseph's condition was more mysterious. His fever was too high, his breathing too rapid, and there were signs of internal bleeding that Elizabeth couldn't explain. She suspected he had been trampled during the massacre, his tiny body crushed by panicking horses or fleeing people. As dawn approached, both children showed signs of improvement. Ayanna's breathing was easier, her color better. Joseph's fever had broken, and he was resting peacefully for the first time since Elizabeth had found him. But their medical progress was overshadowed by a growing sense of danger. Through the window, Elizabeth could see dust clouds on the horizon, riders approaching fast. "Sheriff, She called to Redfield, who had returned with medical supplies and was now keeping watch from the front room. "I see them," he said quietly. "Too many to be a patrol. Looks like a full cavalry unit." Elizabeth's heart sank. How did they find us so quickly? From his chair, Hayes laughed softly. "Did you really think I would come alone? Did you really think I wouldn't have contingencies?" Elizabeth stared at him, understanding dawning. "You sent a message before the raid." "Of course I did. A message to my superiors explaining that I had discovered a conspiracy between a traitorous army nurse and a compromised sheriff. A message requesting immediate backup to deal with the situation. But that means they've been planning this for hours. Planning how to deal with you, how to deal with the sheriff, how to clean up this whole messy situation." Elizabeth felt the walls closing in around her. They had walked into a trap, and now they were about to pay the price. "Sheriff," she said urgently, "we need to move the children. Now." Redfield was already moving, gathering supplies, preparing for flight. "Where can we go? They'll search every building in the territory." Elizabeth's mind raced through possibilities. The mission in Phoenix was too far. The reservation was under military guard. The Apache camps were all destroyed or under surveillance. "The mine," she said suddenly. "The old copper mine in the hills. It's been abandoned for years, but it's deep with multiple passages. They'd never find us there. And if they do," Elizabeth looked at the children, still unconscious, but breathing steadily. "Then we make our stand there. As they prepared to leave, Hayes called out one final time. "Miss Stone, you're making a mistake. These children are going to die anyway. But if you surrender now, if you turn yourself in, I might be able to arrange lenient treatment." Elizabeth paused at the doorway, looking back at the man who had orchestrated so much death and suffering. "Deputy Hayes," she said quietly, "I've taken an oath to preserve life. All life. I'm not going to break that oath now, even if it costs you everything, especially then." As they slipped out the back door, carrying the children toward the hills, Elizabeth could hear the approaching cavalry. Behind them, Hayes's voice rose in a shout. "They're here, the traitors are here." The hunt had begun. The abandoned copper mine was a network of tunnels carved into the hillside, its entrance hidden behind a screen of desert brush. Elizabeth and Redfield made their way deep into the tunnels, carrying the children on makeshift stretchers, following passages that seemed to branch endlessly into the darkness. "Now, this should be far enough," Redfield said, finally setting down his end of Ayana's stretcher. "Even if they find the entrance, they'll never search all these tunnels." Elizabeth checked the children's conditions by lamplight. Both were stable, their breathing steady, their pulses strong. But they were still unconscious, still vulnerable, still dependent on her for their survival. "How long can we stay here?" she asked. Not long," Redfield admitted. "We have water for maybe 2 days, food for less. And the children need more medical attention than you can provide with field supplies." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the impossible position they were in. They couldn't stay, but they couldn't leave. They were trapped between the immediate need to protect the children and the long-term need to find them proper medical care. "There is another option," Redfield said quietly. "What?" "I could surrender. Turn myself in, claim that I was acting alone, that I kidnapped you and the children. It might buy you time to get them to safety." Elizabeth stared at him in the lamplight. "They'd hang you. Maybe. But at least the children would have a chance." "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "We're not sacrificing anyone. There has to be another way." But before Redfield could respond, they heard sounds from the tunnel entrance, voices, footsteps, the clink of metal on stone. The cavalry had found them. "This way," Redfield whispered, picking up his end of the stretcher again. "There's a passage that leads to the back of the mine. It's narrow, but we might be able to get through." They moved deeper into the tunnels, following passages that seemed to wind endlessly through the heart of the mountain. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, men with torches, calling out commands, systematically searching every tunnel. "There," a voice echoed through the passages. "I found tracks." Elizabeth's heart pounded as she realized they were leaving a trail that any competent tracker could follow. The children's stretchers were scraping against the tunnel walls, and their own footprints were clear in the dust. "We need to split up," she said suddenly. "What?" "You take one child, I'll take the other. We go different directions, make different trails. They can't follow both of us." Redfield shook his head. "I won't leave you alone down here. You're not leaving me. You're giving the children the best chance of survival." Elizabeth could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his protective instincts and his logical mind. Finally, he nodded. "I'll take the boy," he said. "You take the girl. If we get separated, there's a way out through the old shaft at the back of the mine. It comes out near the creek." Elizabeth lifted Ayana into her arms, feeling the girl's breathing against her chest. "Sheriff," she said, "whatever happens, know that you did the right thing." "I hope so," he said quietly. "I hope Emma would think so." They separated at the next junction, Redfield disappearing into the darkness with Joseph, while Elizabeth took Ayana down a different passage. The girl was stirring now, her eyes fluttering open in the lamplight. "Miss Elizabeth," she whispered, "where are we?" "Safe," Elizabeth said, though she wasn't sure it was true. "We're somewhere safe." The sounds of pursuit were getting closer, echoing through the tunnels from multiple directions. Elizabeth realized with growing dread that they weren't just being hunted, they were being surrounded. She pressed deeper into the mine, following passages that seemed to branch endlessly. But as she rounded a corner, she found herself face to face with a dead-end solid rock, no way forward. Behind her, she could hear footsteps approaching, the flicker of torchlight growing brighter. She was trapped. Miss Stone. The voice echoed through the tunnel, cultured and confident. "This is Colonel Morrison. I know you're down here. There's no need for further violence." Elizabeth recognized the voice, the fort's commanding officer, a man she had respected and served under for years. But there was something different in his tone now, something that made her skin crawl. "Colonel," she called back, "I have a wounded child with me. She needs medical attention." "I understand," Morrison replied, his voice getting closer. "And she'll receive the best possible care. But first, you need to surrender, for everyone's sake." Elizabeth looked at Ayanna, who was watching her with those trusting dark eyes. The girl had been through so much, seen her family murdered, been shot and wounded, dragged through the desert by strangers. She deserved better than to die in a cave. "All right," Elizabeth called out. "I'm coming out." She stepped into the main tunnel carrying Ayanna and found herself facing not just Colonel Morrison, but a full squad of soldiers. Their weapons were drawn, their faces grim. "Miss Stone." Morrison said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. "I'm sorry it's come to this." "So am I," Elizabeth replied, noting the careful way the soldiers were positioned, the fact that some of them wouldn't meet her eyes. "Colonel, this child needs immediate medical attention. Whatever you think I've done, she's innocent." "I know," Morrison said quietly. "And I wish there was another way. But there are larger considerations here, Miss Stone. Larger than any of us." Elizabeth felt ice forming in her chest. "What kind of considerations?" Morrison gestured to one of his soldiers, who stepped forward with a set of shackles. "The kind that involved territorial policy, federal funding, and the future of Arizona. The kind that are decided by men much more powerful than a country doctor or an army nurse." "You're talking about genocide," Elizabeth said flatly. "I'm talking about progress," Morrison replied. "About civilization. About making this territory safe for decent families to build their lives." "By murdering children?" Morrison's face hardened. "By doing what's necessary. What's always been necessary." As the soldier moved toward her with the shackles, Elizabeth made a desperate decision. She pulled out the small derringer she still carried, pointing it not at Morrison or his men, but at the oil lamp hanging from her belt. "Stay back," she said quietly. "All of you." Morrison's eyes widened as he realized what she was threatening. "Miss Stone, be reasonable. If you destroy that lamp, we'll all be trapped in the dark." "Maybe," Elizabeth said. "But at least Ayanna will have a chance to get away. There's nowhere for her to go. We have men at every entrance. Then we'll die down here together. But I won't let you murder her." For a long moment, the tunnel was silent, except for the sound of breathing and the distant drip of water. Then Morrison spoke again, his voice carefully controlled. "Miss Stone, there's something you need to know. About the massacre at the Apache camp, about why it really happened." Elizabeth kept the gun trained on the lamp, but she was listening. "It wasn't random," Morrison continued. "It wasn't even primarily about the Apache. It was about you. What? You've been under surveillance for months. Your activities, your medical supply runs your relationships with Apache families. Certain interests felt you were becoming too influential, too dangerous to their plans." Elizabeth felt the world spinning around her. "You're saying the massacre was orchestrated to trap me?" "I'm saying that 37 Apache died because powerful men wanted to discredit you. Because they needed evidence of your treason. Because they needed to eliminate you as a threat to their vision of Arizona's future." The weight of this revelation hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. All those people Chief Running Bear, the mothers, the children, they had all died because of her. Because she had tried to help them. You see now, Morrison said gently, why this is bigger than just you and these children. Why we can't let sentiment override necessity. Elizabeth looked at Ayanna, who was watching the exchange with frightened eyes. The girl didn't understand all the words, but she understood the danger. Miss Elizabeth, Ayanna whispered, what are they going to do to us? Elizabeth met the child's eyes, seeing trust there despite everything that had happened. Trust that Elizabeth didn't feel she deserved. I don't know, sweetheart, she said honestly. But I promise you this, whatever happens, I won't let them hurt you. Morrison stepped forward, his hand extended. Miss Stone, please, give me the gun. Let us end this without any more bloodshed. Elizabeth looked at the outstretched hand, then at the soldiers surrounding her, then at the frightened child in her arms. She had perhaps 10 seconds to decide surrender and hope for mercy, or fight and probably die. But before she could make her choice, the decision was taken from her. From the depths of the mine came the sound of gunfire, not the disciplined volleys of soldiers, but the desperate shooting of a man making his last stand. Redfield had been found. The gunfire echoed through the tunnels like thunder, followed by shouts and the sound of running feet. Elizabeth used the distraction to back deeper into the passage, still holding Ayanna, still threatening to destroy the lamp. Sounds like your friend is putting up quite a fight. Morrison said, his voice tight with stress. But it's over, Miss Stone. Sheriff Redfield can't help you now. Maybe not, Elizabeth said, but he's buying us time. Time for what there's no escape from here. No rescue coming, no miraculous salvation. Elizabeth knew he was right. They were trapped in a mine, surrounded by soldiers with no way out. But she also knew that as long as she held the lamp, as long as she could threaten to plunge them all into darkness, she had some small measure of control. Tell me about the conspiracy, she said, playing for time. Who's behind it? Who ordered the massacre? Morrison hesitated, then seemed to decide that the truth couldn't hurt at this point. Territorial land interests, federal politicians, men who see Arizona as the next great opportunity for development and expansion. And the Apache are in the way. The Apache are an obstacle to progress, always have been. The only question was how to remove them efficiently. Elizabeth felt sick. So you decided to frame me for treason to justify a massacre. We decided to eliminate a troublesome variable. You, Miss Stone, with your medical skills and your bleeding heart, were keeping too many Apache alive. You were making it harder to paint them as savage animals who needed to be destroyed. They're not animals. They're people. They're impediments to civilization. And civilization always wins, Miss Stone. Always. The gunfire from the tunnels had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence. Elizabeth's heart sank as she realized what that meant. Sheriff Redfield is dead, Morrison said quietly. And the Apache boy with him. You're all alone now. Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of loss and failure crushing down on her. Marcus Redfield, a man who had found his humanity at the crucial moment, was gone. Little Joseph, who had survived the massacre only to die in a mine shaft, was gone. But Ayanna was still alive, still breathing against her chest, still trusting her to find a way out of this nightmare. What do you want from me? Elizabeth asked. I want you to surrender, Morrison said. Put down the gun, give me the child, and accept that this is over. And then you'll be tried for treason and executed. The child will be sent to a reservation where she'll be re-educated and assimilated into white society. The Apache problem will be solved permanently. Elizabeth looked at Ayanna, seeing the fear and confusion in the child's eyes. This little girl had already lost everything: her family, her home, her entire world. She didn't deserve to lose her identity as well. There has to be another way, Elizabeth said. There is no other way, Morrison replied. There never was. This was all inevitable from the moment you decided to help the Apache. You just delayed the inevitable. But as Morrison spoke, Elizabeth heard something that made her heart leap, the sound of horses approaching the mine entrance, moving fast. Through the tunnels came shouts, confusion, the sound of men scrambling to defensive positions. "What's happening?" Morrison demanded, turning to one of his soldiers. "Unknown riders, sir. Coming in fast from the south." Morrison's face went pale. "How many?" "Hard to say, sir, but they're not army." Elizabeth felt a spark of hope. "Apache war party." "Impossible," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We destroyed all the local bands." The sounds of conflict grew louder. Gunfire shouting the clash of weapons. Someone was attacking the soldiers guarding the mine entrance, and whoever they were putting up a fierce fight. "Sir," one of the soldiers said urgently, "we need to get out of here. If we're trapped in these tunnels..." Morrison's careful composure was cracking. "Who is it who's attacking us?" His question was answered by a voice that echoed through the tunnels, a voice Elizabeth recognized with a shock of disbelief. "This is Sheriff Marcus Redfield. I'm coming down there and I'm bringing friends." Elizabeth stared at Morrison, seeing her own confusion reflected in his face. "I thought you said he was dead." We thought..." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices speaking in Apache. Elizabeth's heart soared as she realized what had happened. Somehow Redfield had survived, and he had brought Apache warriors with him. "Miss Stone." Redfield's voice echoed through the tunnels. "Are you all right?" "Here," Elizabeth called back. "We're here." Morrison raised his weapon, his face twisted with desperation. "This doesn't change anything. You're still trapped, still surrounded." "No," Elizabeth said finally, lowering the gun from the lamp. "You are." The Apache warriors appeared first, moving through the tunnels with silent efficiency. They were painted for war, their faces fierce with determination. Behind them came Redfield, bloodied, but alive, carrying little Joseph in his arms. "You're supposed to be dead," Morrison said, staring at the sheriff. "Takes more than a few bullets to kill a man with a clear conscience," Redfield replied. "Unlike some people." The lead Apache warrior stepped forward, and Elizabeth gasped as she recognized him. Nalnish's brother, a man called Stone Bear, who had been thought dead in the massacre. "The children," Stone Bear said in careful English. "They are safe." "Safe," Elizabeth confirmed, hugging Ayanna tighter. "They're both safe." Stone Bear nodded, then turned to Morrison. "You killed my people. You burned our home. You murdered our chief while he tried to surrender." Morrison raised his rifle, but the Apache warriors were already moving. In seconds, he was disarmed and surrounded his soldiers, either captured or fled. "This is illegal," Morrison protested. "I'm a federal officer. You can't..." "You're a murderer," Stone Bear said simply, "and murderers face justice." Elizabeth looked around at the scene, Apache warriors and a white sheriff working together, the children safe, the conspiracy exposed. It was more than she had dared hope for. "How did you find us?" she asked Redfield. "Stone Bear and his warriors were watching the massacre from the hills," Redfield explained. "They saw what happened, saw us take the children. They've been following us ever since, waiting for the right moment to help." "But why didn't they try to stop the massacre?" Stone Bear's face darkened. "Too few warriors. Too many soldiers. We could not save our people, but we could save the children. We could see that justice is done." Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her face as she realized the full magnitude of what had happened. In the midst of tragedy and betrayal, enemies had become allies. In the face of hatred and violence, compassion had triumphed. But the fight wasn't over yet. The journey back to Prescott took 2 days, with the Apache warriors serving as scouts and guards, while Redfield and Elizabeth cared for the children. Morrison and his surviving soldiers were bound and gagged their weapons, confiscated their arrogance, replaced by fear. As they approached the town, Elizabeth could see dust clouds on the horizon, more soldiers, more officials, more representatives of the conspiracy that had orchestrated the massacre. "They're not going to give up," she said to Redfield. "Too much is at stake." "I know," he replied, "but we have something they don't." "What's that?" "The truth, and witnesses to tell it." Stone Bear rode up beside them, his face grim. "White man's justice," he said. "You believe it will work?" "I have to," Redfield said. "If I don't believe in justice, then I'm no better than the men who killed your people." As they reached the outskirts of Prescott, they were met by a delegation of territorial officials, army officers, and federal marshals. At their head was a man Elizabeth didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I am Governor Safford," the man announced, "and you are all under arrest for conspiracy, treason, and murder." Elizabeth felt her heart sink. They had come so far, survived so much, only to be arrested by the very people who had orchestrated the massacre. But Redfield stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the desert sun. "Governor Safford, I'm Sheriff Marcus Redfield, and I have evidence of corruption and murder that reaches to the highest levels of the territorial government." "You're a wanted man, Redfield, a traitor and a murderer." "I'm a lawman doing his job," Redfield replied calmly. "And my job is to protect the innocent and bring criminals to justice." He pulled out a leather satchel, the same one Elizabeth had seen him with at the mine. "This contains documented evidence of a conspiracy to massacre Apache civilians for the purpose of land speculation. It includes financial records, correspondence, and testimony from witnesses." Safford's face went pale. "That's impossible. There is no such conspiracy." "No. Then you won't mind if we present this evidence to a federal judge," Redfield said. "In fact, I've already sent copies to the Territorial Attorney General and the Federal Marshal in Phoenix." The governor's composure cracked. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with, Sheriff. The interests involve the money at stake. You can't fight this." "Maybe not," Redfield said, "but I can try." Elizabeth watched the confrontation, holding Ayanna close, praying that somehow justice would prevail. The child was watching too, her dark eyes taking in everything, understanding more than her years should have allowed. "Miss Elizabeth," Ayanna whispered, "are the bad men going to win?" Elizabeth looked at the child, then at the assembled officials, then at Stone Bear and his warriors, who were watching silently from the hills. She thought about Chief Running Bear, who had died trying to make peace. She thought about Marcus Redfield, who had found his humanity in the darkness of a mine shaft. She thought about all the people who had died, all the children who had been orphaned, all the families torn apart by greed and hatred. "No, sweetheart," she said quietly. "The bad men are not going to win. Not today." The trial took place in Phoenix, the territorial capital, with federal judges presiding. Elizabeth testified about the massacre, about the conspiracy, about the evidence she had seen. Redfield presented his documentation, his financial records, his proof of corruption. Stone Bear and the other Apache survivors told their stories through interpreters, their voices steady, despite the pain of reliving the tragedy. But it was Ayanna who provided the most powerful testimony. At 8 years old, she stood before the court and described in simple, clear words what she had seen that terrible morning: the soldiers shooting fleeing women, the deputy who had ordered the killing, the nurse who had risked her life to save Apache children. "Miss Elizabeth is a good person," Ayanna said in her careful English. "She helped us when no one else would. She saved our lives." The defense argued that the massacre had been a legitimate military operation, that the Apache had been planning raids, that Elizabeth was a traitor who had aided the enemy. But the evidence was overwhelming, the witness testimony compelling. Governor Safford, Colonel Morrison, and Deputy Hayes, who had survived his wounds, were all convicted of conspiracy and murder. The land speculation scheme was exposed, resulting in the arrest of dozens of officials and businessmen. But the real victory came when the territorial government, under federal pressure, agreed to establish a new reservation for the Apache survivors, with guarantees of protection and medical care. Elizabeth was cleared of all charges and offered a position as chief medical officer for the Territorial Health Service. She accepted, but with conditions. She would work exclusively with Native American communities, and she would have full authority to provide medical care to anyone who needed it, regardless of their race or tribal affiliation. Redfield kept his badge and was promoted to Territorial Marshal tasked with investigating and preventing future atrocities against Native Americans. And the children Ayanna and Joseph were given a choice. They could go to the reservation with the other survivors, or they could be adopted by white families, or they could choose their own path. Ayanna chose to stay with Elizabeth, becoming her assistant and translator. Joseph, now 4 years old and healthy, went to live with Stone Bear and his family, but visited Elizabeth regularly. 5 years later, Elizabeth stood in the clinic she had built near the San Carlos Reservation, reviewing the day's patient records. The building was modest, but well-equipped, funded by federal grants and private donations from across the territory. The door opened, and Ayanna entered now, 13 years old and fluent in both English and Apache. She had grown tall and strong, her dark hair braided with beads that caught the lamplight. "Miss Elizabeth," she said, "there's someone here to see you." Elizabeth looked up to see a familiar figure in the doorway. Marcus Redfield older, now his hair gray at the temples, but his eyes still clear and determined. "Sheriff," she said, standing to greet him. "What brings you all the way out here?" "Marshal," he corrected with a smile. "And I brought someone who wanted to see you." Behind him appeared a young Apache man, tall and serious, with the bearing of someone who had seen too much, too young. It took Elizabeth a moment to recognize him. "Joseph." The young man smiled, and suddenly she could see the frightened 2-year-old she had carried through the desert. "Hello, Miss Elizabeth. I wanted to thank you. Thank me for what? For saving my life. For giving me a chance to grow up to learn to become something more than just another victim of hatred." Elizabeth felt tears threatening. "You don't need to thank me. You survived on your own strength." "Maybe," Joseph said, "but you gave me the opportunity to find that strength." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I brought you something. From the place where our village used to be." Elizabeth opened the pouch and gasped. Inside was a small turquoise stone carved with symbols she didn't recognize. "My grandfather made this," Joseph explained. "Chief Running Bear. He carved it for his granddaughter, for Ayanna, before he died. It's supposed to bring protection and wisdom." Elizabeth looked at the stone, then at Ayanna, who was watching with shining eyes. "This should belong to you. It belongs to the person who needs it most," Joseph said. "The person who protects our people, who heals our wounds, who bridges the gap between our worlds." Elizabeth closed her fingers around the stone, feeling its warmth against her palm. "What will you do now?" "I'm going to school," Joseph said. "In the East. I want to become a doctor like you. I want to come back here and help my people." "And then," Joseph smiled, "then I'll teach other Apache children to become doctors and nurses and teachers. We'll build our own hospitals, our own schools, our own future." Elizabeth looked at Ayanna, who was nodding enthusiastically. "We're going to change the world, Miss Elizabeth. One patient at a time." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, Elizabeth stood with the 2 children she had saved, watching the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new opportunities to heal and help. But tonight, she was content to know that in a world too often ruled by hatred and fear, compassion had found a way to triumph. The children of the desert wind would grow up to build a better world, one where healing knew no boundaries and hope could flourish even in the harshest places. The turquoise stone warm in her palm, Elizabeth smiled and prepared to face whatever tomorrow might bring.